Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm the director of the centre and an author. And today I am joined by special guest Gabriel Schenk. Now, Gabriel, perhaps you could introduce yourself just a little to the listeners.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Julia. My name is Gabriel. I teach online at Signum University, which is an online university specializing in fantasy studies and as an MA in Tolkien studies as well. I did my PhD, or as we call it in Oxford, a DPhil, in Arthurian literature at Oxford, specifically at Pembroke College, which is the college where Tolkien was for about 20 years, where he wrote The Hobbit and most of the Lord of the Rings. And I also work for a Japanese charity in my spare time. So I split my time between lots of different things at the moment and help out with various things as well. I'm based near Oxford and I love reading fantasy and talking about fantasy.
So that's a little taster of the kind of area we'll be covering. But we're talking in the week when you have just hosted the annual Tolkien lecture. And I think a lot of people listening to this, we're really interested to hear about the existence of this lecture, who your guests in the past have been and who it was this year. So perhaps we could start by talking a little bit about that. You're on the committee organising this, are you, and inviting people?
Absolutely, yeah. So about 10 years ago, back in 2012, my friend and I, who were both doing our PhDs at Oxford at Pembroke College in English, realized that there was nothing in the college to ever say that Tolkien had been there. We found one painting which was actually donated by Tolkien to the college, and that was it. That was the only hint that he'd been there. Meanwhile, there was a Samuel Johnson building because Samuel Johnson had been there briefly as an undergraduate. There were, various other people commemorated all throughout the college. So it felt like a bit of an oversight, and we wanted to do something to commemorate Tolkien. And back in 2012, it didn't feel like there was a huge amount out there doing that. I think there was a lot of appreciation for Tolkien's work, but not necessarily a sense that academia had caught up with that. Not many people doing PhDs on Tolkien compared to today, I mean, and not many things sort of celebrating his work and by extension celebrating fantasy and science fiction. There's still kind of a bit of a sense that people were sort of looking down on it to some extent. Maybe, I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but we thought we really wanted to do something to commemorate Tolkien and also to celebrate fantasy and to promote it as a subject that is worth serious study. I studied Arthurian literature, stories about King Arthur, partly because I wanted to study fantasy, but I needed to find a legitimate way in to that topic, which is a bit silly. You should just be able to study what you want to study. As much as I love Arthurian literature, it felt a bit silly to have to sort of sneak around the topic of fantasy when there was so much fantastic, incredible work being done in fantasy and science fiction, and it was so worthy of study. And people are studying it and were studying it back then as well. But it wasn't kind of as much on the surface publicly as we thought it should be. So we started up this lecture series in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien. But the lecture itself is on fantasy literature, fantasy very broadly defined, a bit like in the Hugo Awards. So it can include science fiction, it can include speculative fiction. We don't get too engrossed in defining what is and isn't fantasy. We invite leading professionals, writers, editors, artists in the field of fantasy to talk about their thoughts on the field as broadly as that. So we had Kid Johnson give the first lecture back in 2013, and she's an amazing writer and an academic as well. And then that was followed by Professor Adam Roberts from Royal Holloway University, who is also an incredible writer and an incredible academic. So there's a bit of a theme going there because we like to sort of mirror Tolkien a little bit in that he was an academic, a scholar, but also a fantasy writer, of course. And then we've had just so many brilliant speakers. I mean, Marlon James, Lev Grossman, Terry Windling, who's also an editor, an artist, as well as a writer. Susan Cooper, who was taught by C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and is just one of the most important fantasy writers ever as well in her own right. And recently on Monday, we had Rebecca F. Kwong give her speech, which was delayed from 2020. She was supposed to give it in May 2020. Of course, the pandemic intervened. She was actually in Oxford at the time doing a master's, and she had to evacuate the city in the middle of the night. And then we had a kind of Zoom symposium to make up for that in 2020, which was a lot of past speakers, including our then future speaker, Rebecca. And that was called Fantasy in Times of Crisis. And that's a really interesting discussion that you can look at on YouTube if you're interested in that topic. And then the following year, we had a Zoom lecture with Guy Gabriel Kay, who, again, is an incredible fantasy writer, but also has this history of working with Christopher Tolkien on the Silmarillion. So that was a kind of nice link, even though he didn't talk about that. It was a nice link to have that. And then finally, we got to have the in-person lecture that was always intended for 2020. And Rebecca spoke on Monday, which was the 23rd of May, in person with a packed audience. And we got to do all the great things that we can't do over Zoom. As much as I love things like this, online teaching and online conversations, they're great. But there's some things you can't do. And we could have we could sort of hang out a bit more and exchange ideas a bit more freely. And it was a brilliant lecture. Highly recommend you watch the recording if you haven't done so already. It's on YouTube.
We'll be putting the links into the show notes so people can find.
Brilliant. Yeah, do check it out. What I find with the Tolkien lectures is I get a lot out of it the first time, but then if I keep on going back to it, I keep on getting more and more out of it because they tend to be scholarly but accessible. So there's a lot of quotations, a lot of ideas. And Rebecca had been thinking about this talk for at least 2 years. And it kind of responds to the panel discussion we had, which is why write fantasy when there are bad things happening in the world? How much is this actually helping? And she comes to some beautiful conclusions about the value of art. And beauty and truth and all that good stuff. But she expresses it so brilliantly and I think in a very relatable way, like a lot of the things she's talking about, I've struggled with as well. And along the way, she gives some really interesting insights into the publishing industry and the Q&A, especially. The lecture itself is it's about 35 minutes long. And then the rest of the video is the Q&A, which expands on some of her ideas. So do check it out and check out our previous videos as well. We've got all the previous lectures recorded, and they're all really, really useful and inspiring and full of great ideas.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was interested in hearing her say is you could hear the weariness in her voice of, because she is Chinese American heritage, of having always to be, in some sense, seen as a flag carrier. And there was one particularly telling phrase about publishing, predominantly white publishing, white people in publishing, sort of presenting writers from other communities as though they've saved them. Here we are. Here's our flagship person for this particular ethnicity. And I just felt I sympathized with her so much when I heard that. I thought, oh yeah, I've got a good friend who was an editor of mine and also a writer, Jasmine Richards, who has come on one of our courses, spoke on one of our courses. I remember her saying, she's from a Black British person. She said, I want a kid living in Brixton just to be able to write about a dragon egg that they find, not the experience of a Black person living in Brixton who finds a dragon egg, just freeing them up from the responsibility of having to, always feel that they're having to think about identity politics when they just want to tell a story. So I'm looking forward to catching up with the rest of the lecture. Right. So that's just brilliant. I'm so pleased that you've made this move to honour Tolkien in his college. But we're now going to have a quick look at Arthurian literature, because, as you said, when you look at the inheritance of the literature that we've got, even though people have been sniffy till fairly recently about fantasy literature, they've been teaching it for years. Gulliver's Travels, Pilgrim's Progress, Beowulf. It's you can't really move without finding what we would call fantasy literature. And of course, in the heart of that is the Arthurian cycle, the Matter of Britain. So how did you get there, and what are your main Arthurian writers that you follow, as it were? Where's your interest settled in that?
Right. Well, I came to Arthur as a child, as a lot of people do. I remember going over to my grandparents' house and watching The Sword and the Stone on VHS, which is the Disney film. And my grandmother showed it to me, and I loved it. And then I played, as one of King Arthur's knights with my friends afterwards. And then when I did my master's at Durham, I did a fantastic course called Narrative Transpositions, and we read Homer, and we read Malory, and we read various other authors, big, epic volumes. We read Malory. So Thomas Malory wrote this book called Le Morte d'Arthur in the late 15th century. It was about 1470, and then it was published 1485. And it's an enormous book. It's in the background somewhere there, but it's about this big. And he collates all these different sources. I always feel like I should back up whenever I talk about King Arthur, just specify he probably wasn't real. Sorry to disappoint.
No, don't.
But I think the literature is so much more interesting than the reality. If he had been real, he would have been like a kind of Celtic warlord or something. And there's actually some really good fiction written about that setting. So Rosemary Sutcliffe, I think, is the absolute best at that. Sword at Sunset is a beautiful novel, which is kind of like the historical Arthur. But most of what we mean by King Arthur actually is medieval retellings of Arthur. So Geoffrey of Monmouth being pretty much the earliest written down. I'm terrible with dates off the top of my head, but we're talking about kind of 11th to 12th century, that sort of time. And then 13th century, French writers come in, and Welsh writers in the collection known as the Mabinogion, French writers such as Chrétien de Troyes, Marie de France. And they kind of create more of a kind of romantic, chivalrous, exciting, adventurous Arthur, a bit more with more of what we might recognize as fantasy elements as well. And then Malory sort of collates a lot of these sources together, puts them all into this enormous book, Le Morte d'Arthur, which I read during my master's. And it was, it's a big book. It's 600, 700 pages. But I loved it. I think a lot of people with Malory discover, to their surprise, that it's not dry. It feels very real. The characters feel real. There's a lot of lists in it. There's a lot of kind of the results of tournaments and things like that. So there are bits you can sort of skim read. But there's also the sense that these are real characters. And most of the time, the stories aren't actually about Arthur. Arthur's in the background. Get Arthur at the beginning, Arthur at the end. Most of the story is about Arthur's knights and sorceresses and dragons and quests and so on. So it's great fun, and it really helped me understand. It was a kind of missing link in my love for fantasy, because I grew up with Tolkien and Lewis, Narnia and Middle-earth, and I could see the roots of that in Arthurian literature, specifically in Sir Thomas Malory. And
we should just say here that its title is a bit of a misnomer, because La Morte d'Arthur is the death of Arthur. You get far more than just Arthur's death.
Yes, exactly. And it's not French as well, so that confuses people too. So it's in English. It's written in English. It's written in Middle English. You can still understand the original, as well. We don't know exactly how Malory wrote it, but we have Caxton's printed version, which came out shortly after Malory wrote it. And then there are kind of updated editions that update the spelling and so on, which are much easier to read. There's a big debate about the title. Some people think that Caxton gave it to the title Le Morte d'Arthur because he got confused and he just thought the name of one section was the name of the entire thing. But other people have argued that actually Le Morte d'Arthur is a good title for the whole thing, because although it's not all about the death of Arthur, it's all leading up to that point. A lot of people see the Arthurian legend as essentially a tragedy, which, you can certainly make that argument. I'm not sure I personally agree. But so it's an incredible work. I do recommend slogging through it. There's some beautiful, beautiful things inside. And it was really eye-opening for me. And then when I went to do my PhD, I was looking around for topics. And I remember I was listening to the soundtrack of, I think it was a 1998 TV movie called Merlin, starring Sam Neill. And it has this amazing soundtrack. And I was on the YouTube comments page for the soundtrack. And someone had written a comment saying, "I wish I could live back in this time." And I was thinking, this is weird because this time never existed, especially not in the time depicted in Merlin, which has magic and so on. But they wanted to live in another time, even though it didn't exist. They were nostalgic for something that never existed. And I thought this is a fascinating phenomena. And that led me to do my master's on William Morris at Durham. William Morris wrote kind of very early fantasy, late prose romances such as The Wood Beyond the World and The Well at the World's End. And then for my PhD, I thought, well, I'll just keep on going down this track and look at King Arthur as a way of understanding fantasy. And so I focused on revival Arthurian literature from the 19th century and the 20th century. King Arthur kind of went away in the 18th century when we all sort of became very rational for about 100 years. And then he was republished. Le Morte d'Arthur was republished in 1816 in 2 new editions. And there was about a 186-year hiatus when you couldn't get a new copy of Le Morte d'Arthur. And then it came back 2 new editions in 1816, 3rd edition in 1817. It's never stopped being popular since then. There was an explosion of interest in King Arthur. Then you get, King Arthur plays, King Arthur chocolates, King Arthur hotels, and then into the 20th century, King Arthur movies, King Arthur theme parks. It's just everything goes kind of crazy King Arthur. So it's a really fascinating period to study. And that's what I focused on in my PhD research. And I've just finished giving a course at Signum University called The Return of King Arthur, which is about this period as well. Why did Arthur come back? What does it mean for Arthur to come back? Because essentially he always comes back. Every new edition, every new retelling is a return. And every time the Arthurian story is told, it's told differently. So you won't hear me saying, this is the story. There is no single story. It's a playground for authors to explore ideas. Tennyson did that. T.H. White did that. Tracy Dion recently in the Legend-Born series is doing that as well. Every author brings something new to it, a new perspective. And so that's what's really enjoyable about reading Arthurian literature and really enjoyable about studying it as well.
I've done that. I did it for kids a few years ago.
Oh, nice.
With University Press. I did Young Knights of the Round Table, which was a sort of my take on it was that the Fey world was a kind of Arthurian world, and that it was about changelings, and the children over there were a bit like they're in North Korea. They were told that humans were the enemy. So it's kind of flipping the Arthurian story, looking at it from the Morgan Le Fay side. Anyway, why do you think Shakespeare didn't write, the tale of King Arthur? Because they obviously had the Spencer Fairy Queen at the time, which was like a huge book in his own era, but there was never the play.
Yeah, I mean, unless he wrote it and it's lost. I mean, for a long time, the birth of Merlin.
That would be a great story.
There's a novel called The Tragedy of Arthur, which is about that, about the idea that he did write a play and it was rediscovered. And then I've forgotten who the author is, but it's quite a good novel. And at the end, the author has reconstructed the entire play. Obviously made it up, but if you want to read what a Shakespeare play about King Arthur would look like, you can read The Tragedy of Arthur. But yeah, it's a really good question, because Shakespeare drew on a lot of folklore and history as well. I mean, King Lear is, maybe his closest equivalent. I mean, John Milton also didn't write about Arthur. He thought about it, and ended up writing Paradise Lost instead. I think with Shakespeare, he was writing enough other stuff. He was quite busy. So he just didn't get around to it. He may have felt it had already been done. He would have had the Fairy Queen, but he would have had access to Le Morte d'Arthur as well, I should think. And Le Morte d'Arthur is quite Catholic. There's quite a lot of masses in this. So there's a lot about the Holy Grail, which is the cup that Christ used. So maybe he didn't want to go down that route. He does mention Arthur a few times. There's about 2 or 3 mentions of Arthur and about 2 mentions of Merlin. Falstaff is a character who appears in a few of Shakespeare's plays, mentions Arthur. So, Shakespeare was definitely aware of him. But I think there's a lot of plays from that period about Arthur that were lost. A lot of plays, full stop, that were lost. And there's some really interesting work being done. I went to a talk recently by D. Phil at Jesus College, Oxford, who was working on early modern Arthurian plays. And sometimes we only have the titles. So there's a whole kind of world in that era that we don't know about. But it's a fascinating question to think. Yeah. Why didn't Shakespeare write about it?
So it skips a couple of the big ones, like Shakespeare and Milton in a considerable way. But the one that I land on next is Tennyson. Have I missed anybody out before that?
Not really, I don't think.
Okay, that's good, because otherwise I'd sue Cambridge and Oxford for my education. Right. Okay, so I'm okay. So in Tennyson, you've got a poetic approach to Arthur with Idylls of the King. Mm-hmm. And that comes along with a whole craze for Arthurian names. If you just look at the names of, particularly for women, just the whole, Elaine and all of this, suddenly this is a really common name people are using. It was obviously a real craze in Victorian society. So what's your feelings you mentioned you went to William Morris, but what do you think about the Tennyson poetry?
I love Tennyson. I adore Tennyson. Idylls of the King, or Idylls of the King, depending on how you said, is not everyone loves it. Some people have some issues with some of the idylls, such as Guinevere. And just to explain, they're 12 kind of separate narrative poems that are written in blank verse. So they're quite easy to read for poetry. It's not rhyming. It's just kind of a flowing story. And the idylls vary a lot. So some of them are kind of intimate sort of domestic dramas, kind of one-to-one, like Merlin and Nimue. Some of them are kind of more like epics, the coming of Arthur, the passing of Arthur. Some are almost like fairy tales. There's elements in the passing of Arthur that is like a fairy tale, with the repetition of the Excalibur going into the lake and so on. So even within...
Go in 3 times.
Yeah, exactly, 3 times. And the number 9 turns up a lot in the text as well. So even within a single section, there's a lot of variety, which I think makes them fascinating. Incredibly beautiful, I think, incredibly beautiful verse. And I think he really captures the spiritual side of the legend as well. And it was interesting teaching Tennyson recently at Signum, because some people really were very moved by Tennyson, by Idylls of the King and the religious elements. Some people were a bit more turned off by that. So there's something in Arthurian literature for everyone. If you've read a bit of Arthurian literature and you think that's not for me, just find something else, because, it was interesting hearing you talk about your story. You can take so many different approaches to it. You can take so many different angles. And I think one thing that I want to remind people about Tennyson is that he was kind of radical for his time, because he became poet laureate and is quoted and studied in school. He becomes this establishment figure. But he was taking a big, bold risk writing about Arthur, and he was very anxious about that. It took him a long time to write Idylls of the King. It was really his life's work. He wrote the first lines when he was in his early 20s, and he was working up on it still up to his deathbed in his late 80s, I think. So it was a great labor of love for him. And the first thing he published was a kind of framing device for what would later become The Passing of Arthur. And the framing device is that someone found this poem and the author had burnt all the other parts of it because it wasn't good enough. Because why should man remodel models? Why go back to the past? We can't bring back the past, so why should we even try? And this is Tennyson's sort of anxiety about what am I even doing? Why I should be writing about contemporary things? Why am I writing about someone who probably never even existed? But I'm glad he did persevere with that, because then that becomes a standard thing. No one's going to say, why are you writing about King Arthur anymore, because of the work that he did. But it's worth remembering that was bold and radical at its time, to sort of establish that and help establish what later becomes the fantasy genre as well.
So we had a podcast devoted to William Morris with Dr. Ingrid Hansen, who's an expert on Morris. And we were talking in that about the defense of Guinevere, which is obviously a really fascinating development of the Arthurian themes, which William Morris ushers in. But we should also mention that William Morris, with his connection to the arts and craft movement and the pre-Raphaelite movement, they're all part of the same movement, really, very much gives us the iconography, which we can all summon up. If I just say, think of a Arthurian lady, you're immediately thinking of those, drop-waisted gowns and the, thick hair, light hair, all of that. The look is very much a pre-Raphaelite look, which is still carried over to understandings of fantasy now. So we've touched on William Morris. I think he also did an edition of Morte Arthur, didn't he, with fantastic from or at least he's done some prints, Arthurian prints. Woodcut.
Yeah, possibly from the Kelmscott publishers. I'm not sure I've seen that actually. But there's, Aubrey Beardsley has did prints which are kind of quite similar. I mean, they're Art Nouveau rather than pre-Raphaelite, but they're sort of quite arresting as well. And I think Morris certainly did prints for some of his Arthurian poems.
Okay, so, maybe that's what I'm thinking of then.
Yeah,
I'm not. If you haven't heard of it, then I'm probably wrong. So then moving on into the 20th century, also on these podcasts, we've spent a couple of times we've thought about Charles Williams, who of course writes his extraordinary Arthurian poems centered around Taliesin the Bard figure. But before we get to Charles Williams, who's writing in the 1930s, is there anybody else who bridges us in the Edwardian period, carrying the Arthurian flame forwards?
Yeah, there's lots. I mean, not necessarily big names. There was a lot of very good drama, sort of fin de siècle, 1890s, Edwardian era. There was a big kind of blockbuster performance of King Arthur, the Lyceum Theatre, starring Sir Henry Irving, who was the first actor ever to be knighted, with Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, as the stage manager, and Ellen Terry as Guinevere. So these are, the biggest names in the 19th century stage.
What a production team that would have been.
Amazing. And you can still read the scripts, and there's lots of kind of photographs and stuff of the performance and stuff. So that's kind of fascinating one to think about. Although you really need to have been there, I feel. The script isn't quite good enough, but you get the sense of the scale of it. Another author I really, really highly rate is Clemence Houseman, who is the sister of A.E. Houseman.
Ah.
And she, incredible writer. Highly recommend her. Douglas Anderson has included her in Tales Before Tolkien as kind of roots of modern fantasy. He's one of the world experts on Houseman. And she wrote a novel called The Life of Sir Aglovale de Garlis. She spent about 16 years writing it. I taught it recently in this course. It was published, I think, 1906, around that time. Taught it in the Signum University course, and the reaction from the students was quite a few of them said when they started it, first 10, 50 pages, they were thinking, why are we reading this? And then about 100 pages in, they were thinking, this book has changed my life. Like, it is just extraordinary. It's so intense. There's so much in it. It's written in this kind of old sort of Mallory style. It's very kind of close to Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, and actually even quotes Mallory verbatim within the narrative without you even realizing what Houseman is doing. But it is this really intense psychological journey about a minor character in Arthur's court, Sir Aglavale. So that's a really fascinating one, and I think that one needs to be read more and known more. And then 1930s, I mean, you have the beginning of T.H. White's The Once and Future King. So The Sword and the Stone comes out in the late 1930s. And that's kind of the next big thing, really. The Once and Future King is a really big, important epic. But Charles Williams fits in around that time too.
I've just spent some time thinking about that book because I was reading H is for Hawk by which is a book about training a hawk by Helen Macdonald, and she is basically partnering throughout with her thoughts about T.H. White, and because he also wrote a book about training a hawk. And it was particularly interesting to read her take on the bits when Wart, the boy who becomes the Once and Future King, is turned into animals, and how this is a very good companion piece. If you're thinking of how do I get into the Once and Future King, I would imagine this is a very good way of approaching it, because it picks out themes about the way that Arthur is used to reflect on contemporary issues that everybody has, and his identity issues for T.H. White.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so MacDonald makes the case that White was a deeply unhappy man, and that's fair enough. I mean, I've been to White's archives, which are weirdly enough in Austin, Texas, and the Harry Ransom Center, and they've got all of his journals and diaries and letters and so on. So I've read through all his journals whilst he was writing The Once and Future King. And he was suffering. He was a bit tortured. He was very isolated, very lonely. He was a repressed homosexual. He was given some very bad psychological advice about repressing his homosexuality. He was kind of feeling very cut off from the rest of the world. And he was in Ireland at the time. The rest of the world, well, his country, England, was going to war. And he felt like, he should really help out with that, but he didn't know how to. And he was kind of a bit useless at the jobs that would be important for the war effort. So he's kind of, he feels very cut off in Ireland. And he channels a lot of his pain into this incredibly beautiful, moving, and powerful story, which he also sees as a tragedy. So, I mean, there's lots of fun things in The Once and Future King, and it is an extremely funny series of books, especially the first one. But there's also pain and sadness in there as well. And I think MacDonald sort of brings that out in H is for Hawk, because that's a book about grief as much as anything else.
Yeah. And maybe that's what's so fascinating about the Arthurian cycle, is it does have this melancholy. It feels for those people who know their Tolkien, that Tolkien is basically part of what's the mix is the, Ragnarok, we're all heading for the great defeat kind of feel. It's getting, we're moving away from a golden age.
Yeah.
And there is definitely that feeling in Arthur too, that the greats go, and they may possibly come back, like in Ragnarok, they may possibly come back. But I don't know if you ever think they will. It's the hope that maybe they will.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the Arthur story is that Arthur is not actually dead, that he's going to come back one day. And there are stories about Arthur coming back, but really it works best if he is some way off into the future. And chivalry itself, the time of chivalry never really existed. This time of knights and quests and so on. There are historical periods of chivalry, but even then they're kind of nostalgic.
Yeah,
even at the time, like even the medieval writers and people, they're trying to recreate something that never really existed. So chivalry always really exists in the past, and Arthur always comes back at a undetermined future date. So there is some kind of hope for it, but there's a yearning too. And I'm reminded, there's a line in a Doctor Who episode, Blink, when one of the characters, Sally Sparrow, says, I like old houses, they're sad. And her friend says, what's so good about sad? And she says, sad is happy for deep people. And that really resonates with me. I love all this kind of sad stuff because it I don't know, it just sort of it inspires me and yeah, it kind of gives me a weird kind of happiness at the same time, because it's not all sad. It's not, there's lots of, not everyone dies at the end, but it is this kind of loss and this yearning, which I think absolutely you also get in Tolkien, the loss of previous civilizations and the sense that even, the elves aren't going to stick around forever, and the old order changeth, yielding place to the new, as Tennyson put it. I think that's absolutely something that Tolkien is getting from Tennyson. He actually translated one of Tennyson's poems, I think it was Break, 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 into Elvish. So he was very taken by Tennyson, and Tennyson, Break, Break, Break. It was either that poem or Crossing the Bar, both written about Arthur Hallam, who was, this man that Tennyson loved deeply and died before his time, and that really, it was like the most life-changing event for Tennyson, and a lot of that goes into Idylls of the King. A lot of that goes into all his poetry, and I think Tolkien himself, had early losses. His mother, his father, his friends in the First World War, and even before the First World War. There's something that speaks to those writers about fantasy and Arthur. And of course, Tolkien wrote his own Arthurian poem as well, The Fall of Arthur, which is incomplete but still published. And that's tremendous too.
And of course, C.S. Lewis, it's full of Arthurian. I mean, we haven't got time to cover it here, but just for people who've read Narnia, for example, they'll know that again and again there is an Arthurian feel, almost like Arthur rejuvenated in Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. The way that the leadership is described as being shared. The Order of Knights. Anyway, we can go on. There's loads of it. And of course, C.S. Lewis was the great medievalist and knew all this stuff inside out. But maybe people would be interested to know what you rate as really good Arthurian entertainment on their TV or film choices. So let's come bang up to date. This keeps coming up. Sometimes relatively big film, sometimes missing the mark. But what's your feeling of Arthurian themed series that people should dip into?
Well, I really enjoy Merlin, the BBC TV series, and that's something a lot of people have watched in Britain, at least.
I think that's available on Netflix actually now, so easily available.
It's great fun. I mean, if you've seen Smallville or Gotham, it's a similar kind of story in that it's the kind of the prequel series when Merlin and Arthur were young. Of course, Merlin in most versions isn't the same age as Arthur, but it doesn't matter. You can do what you like with the legend, and they have great fun with them. They have great sort of banter. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, I mean, I kind of maybe shocked my students when I was teaching King Arthur recently, because I said, I don't actually care about King Arthur. I don't have like a King Arthur duvet set. I don't have like a King Arthur cuddly toy. I'm not a King Arthur fan. That's not what I'm fascinated about with the Arthurian legend. King Arthur isn't actually about King Arthur. King Arthur is about people and people's relationships. And the best Arthurian fiction, whether that be TV or film or books, is about those human relationships. So I think that's something that the Merlin series does well. In terms of films, I mean, Excalibur is worth watching. It's very intense. 1983, something like that, early 80s. And actually, John Boorman, the director, wanted to get the rights to Lord of the Rings and couldn't, so he did King Arthur instead. But that's quite intense. I would say The Kid Who Would Be King, directed by Joe Cornish, is much more accessible and fun. That's a recent film that came out a few years ago. And I also think, though it's a bit controversial, the Guy Ritchie King Arthur film, King Arthur: Legend of the Sword, is actually a lot of fun. I rewatched it recently. It's much better than I remember it being. I think when it came out, a lot of us were sort of feeling like, oh, this goes too far.
Who's the lead in that one?
Charlie Hunnam, I think his name is.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
I might be misremembering his name.
I'm afraid I get confused with the Robin Hood films.
Because
they often run parallel, that if someone's doing King Arthur, there's also a Robin Hood film happening. Okay, right.
It's a similar kind of thing. And it's very much a Guy Ritchie version of King Arthur. So there's even a bit where Bedivere says, we've got to assault the castle and we've got to bring, all these armies. And you think, okay, well, this is like a standard kind of Lord of the Rings sort of fantasy story with the big armies and so on. And then King Arthur, played by Charlie Hunnam, says, no, what we've got to do is get a couple of diamond geezers and we'll go and do a heist. Yes. And that's what they do. So it's like it almost goes that way, the standard route. And then it's actually a very different kind of story. And it's just great fun. And it's great costumes. Don't analyze it too much. Don't go into it thinking I want historical realism, because you're not going to get it in any Arthurian story. So you might as well enjoy the ride. So those are the ones I would pick out, I think, for accessible kind of TV and film. I did think that Cursed, which was on Netflix, was actually doing some really interesting things. Unfortunately, it got cancelled after one season, but it is still worth checking out. And that's about Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. This is from her perspective. And it's a shame because they were pushing things in some interesting directions in that series. But that's another recent one which I enjoyed.
So thank you. That's fantastic. So just before we get to Where in the World, how I usually end, Gabriel, you're also involved in curating some literary estates associated with the Inklings. So maybe you want to say a little bit about that role and what that involves.
Yeah. So I work with Owen Barfield's grandson on the Owen Barfield Literary Estate. And that's been great fun and very rewarding. I've been doing that for over 10 years now. And we've seen interest in Barfield grow in that time. Barfield is one of the Inklings who is arguably the most important, because he sort of glues everyone together. And you can find so much of Tolkien and Lewis in Barfield, or rather the other way around, so much of Barfield in Tolkien and Lewis. Huge influence on them both, especially Lewis. And but so someone who's been sort of a little bit more forgotten than the others, because he didn't write like a big fantasy universe. That was his mistake, I guess. But a fantastic philosopher, and wrote lots of, wrote the first Inklings fairy tale, The Silver Trumpet, which is available on the website. And so that's something I've been involved in getting the word out about Barfield, making the information as accessible as possible. Because Tolkien and Lewis are so big, the literary estates have to be a bit more closed off and protective. Whereas with Barfield, we're bringing everyone in. We're putting up, there's lots of text that you can just read for free on the website. There's fantastic Facebook discussion board. There's YouTube videos. Barfield has a reputation of being quite difficult to understand. And it is proper deep philosophy that he's writing about. But it's actually very accessible once you get your head around it. And especially if you're not Christian, that you will find lots in Barfield. Because I think some people feel like they're missing stuff out, especially in Lewis, if they're not Christian, because Christianity is so central to Lewis and to a lesser extent to Tolkien, whereas Barfield is kind of writing for everyone and a much kind of broader approach. And the brilliant novel to read actually is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which I adored. And that is laced with Barfieldian philosophy. And she was inspired by Barfield to write it. And she mentions Barfield by name at one point. That kind of central idea is extremely Barfieldian, and it's also really important to fantasy. So if you're interested in the study of fantasy, you have to read Barfield. You have to engage with Barfield. And that's been a really fun thing that I've been involved in with the Barfield Literary Estate.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So, right. Down to the final question, which is where in all the fantasy world is best? And in your honor, because we've been talking about Arthur, I'm going to ask where in all the fantasy worlds is the best place to find an enchanted sword? Now, obviously, perhaps we could just put aside Excalibur because it might be like the winner just because it's the most famous enchanted sword. So we'll all just do a sort of nod to Excalibur. But in other books you've read, what enchanted sword has taken your fancy?
Well, I mean, the first thing to explain is that Excalibur and the Sword and the Stone are separate, usually. I mean, sometimes they're combined because it makes more sense. But Excalibur comes from the Lady of the Lake and it's an important sword. Although in Mallory, it's not actually the sword that's important, it's the scabbard. The scabbard is the enchanted part, which means that you won't die, you won't lose any blood as long as you've got the scabbard. The Sword of the Stone is just a sword that just proves that Arthur is the rightful king. But the sword itself isn't actually important. So if we assume that Excalibur is the sword from the lake, and we're nodding at that, but not going into detail, I would still say that enchanted lakes are good sources for swords. I mean, in the real world, people do drop swords and they get washed up on the shoreline, and there are stories of children finding swords, and the story becomes the new King Arthur, and why not? But yeah, the sword in the stone would be another place to find good swords, especially if you can pull it out. There's some great stories. There's a short story by Jane Yolen written in the 1980s, and there's a short story written in the 1910s, Thomas Wood Stevens, about people pulling the sword out of the stone using their initiative, using science to freeze the metal or to lubricate the metal in order to pull it out, and then becoming the rightful owner of Excalibur, the Sword and the Stone, using their ingenuity. So I quite like that. So if you do find a sword in a stone and you can't pull it out because you're not the rightful, you don't have the right lineage, rewrite the story, rebel against the story, and say it's actually about your ingenuity that gives you the right to be the ruler, and find another way of pulling the sword out of the stone. But the only other place I can think of where you might find an enchanted sword would be in a castle, usually with some kind of ritual ceremony involved. Maybe a procession that comes out with the Holy Grail, and then there's a sword there. Quite often there's the Spear of Longinus as well, the Spear of Destiny. If you ever get a vision of a sword, seek that out. It will lead you to a castle. You'll probably have to pass some kind of test. Maybe it's a riddle. Maybe it's a morality test. But if you can pass that test and gain the sword, then it will be a great boon to you. And you can, it will serve you well. I
thought of 3 which don't fit that category. So obviously, let's do a nod to Sting, Bilbo's sword, because it's an early warning system. Excellent use for a sword. Shines blue, get worried. Excellent idea. But the other 2 I thought of, one is in the Percy Jackson series, where he gets the sword, which is from the Greek Olympian gods. And the thing that attracts me to that is it changes shape. So it's a very user-friendly sword. You can carry it around with you in your pocket. And then, of course, probably my favorite sword is actually a lightsaber. Because that was the one I think we were pretending to play with in the playground when I was little. And if you really think about that, that is just an enchanted sword. Yeah. Because it works on the Force. a kind of Jedi magic. I'll probably get loads of people telling me why I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of the Star Wars universe. So I think that up there with Excalibur these days is the lightsaber. It's an instantly recognizable form of enchanted sword. So that's my favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. And both Frodo and Luke gain their swords from inheritance. This is passed down to them from their relatives. And so that's a nice thing as well. And that's the thing about a sword. It lasts practically forever. I mean, you can still find swords buried in the ground. So it represents great continuity. And there's this idea also, there's a period in history after the Romans left when things slid back a bit and there were kind of civil wars and so on. The early medieval period, where you might find an old sword or you might inherit an old sword that is actually really well made and made with a technology that doesn't exist anymore. And that kind of, I think that comes into stories about magical swords. So, the Sting is a really old sword, but it has this amazing properties. It was in this really old battle, killed a lot of goblins. That's very different to today when it's like, you've got to get the new iPhone or something. You're not going to inherit your grandfather's iPhone and it's going to be much better than the current one. So it's a different perspective there, but it's certainly, that's a thing about magic swords. Older is often better.
That's an excellent last thought, inheriting your grandfather's iPhone. That would be quite a thing. So thank you so much, Gabriel. It's lovely talking to you. And I feel we've covered King Arthur quite well in our chat. And people will be, I'm sure, looking up some of those books that you've mentioned, which they weren't already familiar with. So thank you so much. I'm certainly going to go and check them out.
Thank you, and thanks for all the work you do as well. And it's great. I think the Tolkien lecture and fantasy literature is sort of, we're trying to do similar things to what you've been doing as well, which is promote the study of fantasy, but also bring as many people in as possible.
Exactly. The doors should definitely be open. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.